In 1963, the Academy Awards were gearing up for a historic moment. Bette Davis, a two-time Oscar winner and the reigning queen of on-screen intensity, had just delivered one of the most arresting performances of her career in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. The critics were raving, the buzz was strong, and if she won, she'd become the first woman ever to take home 3 Best Actress Oscars. It was more than a nomination. It was a shot at cinematic immortality. Meanwhile, over on Broadway, Anne Bancroft was deep in the trenches of live theater, starring in Mother Courage. Her film role as Annie Sullivan in The Miracle Worker had earned her widespread acclaim and an Oscar nomination of her own. But she wouldn't be attending the ceremony. Her stage schedule simply wouldn't allow it. That's when Joan Crawford, legendary star of the Golden Age and co-lead of Baby Jane, offered to accept the award on Anne's behalf, if she won. Anne graciously agreed. At face value, the gesture seemed thoughtful, even elegant. Joan wasn't nominated that year herself, but she'd graced enough Oscar stages in her time to know how important that moment could be. The only wrinkle! One of the other nominees that year was Bette Davis, Joan's co-star, and, depending on who you asked, her longtime rival. To some, Joan's offer looked like a quiet kindness. To others, it looked like strategy. When Oscar night arrived, the air was thick with anticipation. The envelope was opened.
And the winner is Anne Bancroft in Miracle Worker.
And from the wings, Joan Crawford emerged, regal, poised, and shimmering in silver. She accepted the award with practiced grace, standing center stage in front of the industry that had once crowned her queen. Cameras flashed. Headlines were made. And Bette Davis? She stayed seated, composed but deeply disappointed. It was a public loss, but also a personal one. Later, she would admit that watching Joan accept an award in her category stung in a way few things had. "It was bad enough I didn't win," she reportedly said. "But to see Joan Crawford walk up there and take the Oscar, that I will never forget." It wasn't just about the statue. It was about timing, pride, legacy. The kind of complex moment only Hollywood, and 2 icons who had lived it all, could deliver. To this day, that night remains one of the most talked about Oscar moments in history, not because of scandal, but because of what it symbolized. 2 brilliant, fiercely talented women navigating the spotlight at a time when Hollywood rarely had space for more than one. And whether you saw Joan's gesture as generous or calculated, one thing was certain. Both she and Bette knew exactly how to command a scene, even at the Academy Awards. Before the Oscars, before there was Baby Jane, before the word feud was ever whispered, there were just 2 young women, each with a dream, a train ticket to Hollywood, and a name they didn't quite keep. Let's start with the woman who would one day become Bette Davis. She was born Ruth Elizabeth Davis, a child with big eyes and even bigger ambition. As a teenager, a friend who had just read a French novel suggested that Betty, with a Y, her nickname, might look a bit more continental if she spelled it like the French heroine. Betty, with an E. She liked the elegance of it. And more importantly, she chose it for herself. When she arrived in Hollywood, a studio executive tried to change her name entirely. This was common practice at the time. Their brilliant idea? Bettina Dawes.
Suggested changing your name, didn't they?
Oh, yes. They wanted to call me Bettina Dawes. And to be a little vulgar in this illustrious group, I said I refuse to be called between the drawers all my life. Which I would have. No question.
Bette Davis, never one to go along quietly, promptly refused. That act of defiance set the tone for her entire career. And then, meet Lucille Lesieur. Lucille was a dancer from Texas with striking beauty and an iron will. When she signed with MGM, the studio executives decided her name was too difficult and launched a public contest to find her a new one. The winning entry was Joan Arden, except that name was already taken, so she got the runner-up name, Joan Crawford. She didn't love it. In fact, she thought it sounded a little too much like crawfish, but she accepted it anyway. Because for Joan, this wasn't about rebellion, it was about survival. Betty's name was an act of assertion. Joan's was an act of adaptation. And that contrast, assertion versus adaptation, would come to define how both women navigated Hollywood. Bette Davis came from the theater, with formal training, sharp instincts, and no patience for nonsense. She didn't play the game. She rearranged the board. She took on roles most actresses avoided. Unglamorous, unsympathetic, bold. She shaved her eyebrows to play Queen Elizabeth, wore little makeup in Of Human Bondage, and even dyed her hair back to brunette behind the studio's back.
When I went to Warner's, they made me, really bleach my hair. And I knew it was going to limit me with part, so I snuck down one day and had it, put back the ash blonde hair I'd always had. And 1 year later, Mr. Wallace sent for me and said, "You've had your hair re-dyed." 1 year later. He'd never seen it. But if I had gone for permission, he wouldn't have allowed it, you see.
She didn't just act. She challenged the entire studio system. She sued Warner Brothers for better roles. She became the first female president of the Academy. They didn't call her the fourth Warner brother for nothing. Meanwhile, Joan Crawford was mastering a different art, adaptation. She came into the industry with little formal training, but endless determination. She studied photography to understand how lighting shaped her face. She trained herself out of a Southern accent. She covered her freckles, sculpted her look, and curated her image until she was the image. Where Bette found power in rejecting glamour, Joan found power in perfecting it. And she was good at it, ruthlessly good. She was the flapper in the 1920s, the working woman in the 1930s, and the fierce matriarch in the 1940s. She evolved with the times, always aware of what the audience and the studios wanted to see. So no, Bette and Joan were not two sides of the same coin. They were two entirely different currencies, but both had immense value, and both understood the cost. They weren't born legends. They became them, not because the industry made it easy, but because they refused to be forgotten. In the early decades of Hollywood, film studios weren't just employers, they were monarchies. Each studio had its own stable of stars, and once you signed your name on the dotted line, you lived under that banner like it was your coat of arms. For Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, that meant two very different kingdoms. Bette reigned at Warner Brothers, Joan ruled at MGM, and while the press would later spin their story as one long catfight, the truth is, for most of their careers, they weren't even in the same arena. They were more like rival empresses, each holding court in their own land. At MGM, Joan Crawford was pure royalty, and like any royal, her ascent wasn't without struggle. She started as a chorus girl and spent her early years trying to outshine the studio's reigning queen, Norma Shearer, who, as it happened, was also married to MGM's head of production, Irving Thalberg. So, no pressure. In 1930, when MGM was casting The Divorcee, a daring role about infidelity, Joan seemed like the obvious choice. Bold, modern, magnetic. But then Norma decided she wanted the part. Thalberg was hesitant. He didn't think Norma could pull off sexy. She proved him wrong with one strategically seductive photo shoot. She got the role, she won the Oscar. And just like that, a rivalry was born, not personal necessarily, but symbolic. Joan wasn't just fighting for parts, she was fighting for status. And in that fight, she learned to play the long game. Throughout the 1930s, she kept adapting, from flappers to working girls to steely women with diamond-hard gazes. She watched the tides shift and moved with them. But MGM, ever the prestige studio, began to shift its affections elsewhere. By the 1940s, Joan found herself in the shadow of a new favorite, Greer Garson. Greer was everything the studio now wanted. Elegant, refined, very British. She racked up Oscar nominations like they were thank you notes. Joan, meanwhile, was being handed lesser scripts and fewer chances. It wasn't personal, but it felt personal. And across town, at Warner Brothers, Bette Davis was fighting her own wars. But unlike Joan, Bette wasn't being overshadowed. She was the one doing the overshadowing. From the moment she broke through with Of Human Bondage, she made it clear she wasn't there to be sweet or docile. She wanted the gritty roles, the messy women, the characters with depth. And she was relentless in getting them. She famously took Warner Brothers to court in the 1930s, arguing that her contract was too restrictive and creatively stifling. She lost the lawsuit, but she won the war. The studio, realizing she wasn't going to back down, started giving her better material. It was the beginning of her era. But success didn't come without tension. One of her fiercest studio rivalries was with Miriam Hopkins, a talented actress with a similar taste for complex roles and a similarly sharp tongue. When Miriam bought the rights to the play Jezebel, she assumed she'd star in the film version. Warner Brothers disagreed. They gave it to Bette. Bette won her second Oscar for it. Let's just say things were icy on set when they later co-starred in The Old Maid and Old Acquaintance. Both women were professionals, but the tension practically crackled on screen, and audiences loved it. But even Miriam wasn't Bette's biggest adversary. That honor went to Warner Brothers itself. For every good role she earned, there were 10 she had to fight for. She didn't just want parts. She wanted control. And in a studio system that was built to keep stars in line, Bette's refusal to play nice made her both a legend and a liability. So here we have it. Joan, endlessly shape-shifting at MGM, battling other starlets for the studio's affection. Bette, a thunderstorm in heels at Warner Brothers, battling for creative freedom. And because they were on opposite lots with completely different career tracks, they didn't cross paths often. The idea that they were constantly at each other's throats is a myth. For years, they barely interacted. If anything, they were too busy fighting other battles, internal, external, and contractual. But in the shadows, something was always building. Because Hollywood isn't just a town of stars, it's a town of egos, timing, and long memories. And eventually, those separate paths, they were going to collide. It's 1935. Bette Davis is on the rise. After years of being overlooked in forgettable roles and thankless supporting parts, she finally has her breakout moment in Dangerous, a moody drama where she plays a troubled actress with a dark past. The performance is raw, emotional, and unvarnished. It earns her her first Oscar. But behind the scenes, something else was unfolding. Her co-star in Dangerous was Franchot, a classically trained, impossibly handsome actor known for his polish and charm. Bette fell for him. Hard. And unlike many studio flirtations, this one wasn't fleeting. There was just one small complication. Franchot was already in a relationship with Joan Crawford. Shortly after Dangerous wrapped, Franchot married Joan. Bette was heartbroken. She never forgot it. And although she would go on to have many relationships of her own, along with 2 Oscars, a string of iconic roles, and decades of industry respect, this moment left a bruise. Not a full-blown feud just yet, but certainly a grudge. And for Joan? Well, the marriage to Franchot didn't last. They divorced just a few years later. From this point forward, something had shifted. Their careers would remain separate for a while longer, but this was the moment their names first became tangled in something personal. Not a war? Not yet. But a spark. And in Hollywood, sparks always find fuel. By the early 1940s, Joan Crawford's reign at MGM was quietly ending. After 2 decades of stardom, box office receipts were slipping. The studio, once obsessed with her every mood and movement, was now more enamored with newer faces. Her final few films under contract didn't perform as expected. And then, in a twist only Hollywood could dream up, MGM let her go. It was an unceremonious exit for a woman who had once been the studio's crown jewel. But Joan wasn't about to disappear. She knew how the game worked, and she had no intention of becoming yesterday's headline. In 1943, she signed with Warner Brothers, the very same studio that Bette Davis had ruled for over a decade. Now, to the outside world, this looked like a smart, strategic move for both actress and studio. Joan had name recognition, discipline, and an undeniable screen presence. Warner Brothers had prestige, writers, and directors who knew how to shape comeback narratives. But to Bette, this was a home invasion. Because Bette Davis had fought for her spot at Warner Brothers tooth and nail. She had sued the studio for better roles, gone to war with producers, built a reputation as both a powerhouse and a problem. She didn't get her throne easily. She earned it. And now, here comes Joan Crawford, waltzing into the same kingdom. Same lot, same sound stages, same dressing rooms, same directors. It didn't sit well. Publicly, Bette downplayed it. She said she was focused on her own career. But behind the scenes, insiders whispered about her frustration. She didn't trust Joan. She thought she was phony, too polished, too calculated. Joan, for her part, seemed unbothered. She was polite, punctual, and determined to prove she still had what it took. And within 2 years, she did. In 1945, she starred in Mildred Pierce, a melodrama about a fiercely ambitious mother sacrificing everything for her daughter. It was Joan's first major Warner Brothers role, and she knocked it out of the park. Critics raved, audiences loved it. Joan Crawford won the Oscar for Best Actress. By 1950, Bette Davis needed a hit. Her contract with Warner Brothers had ended the year before, and frankly, the offers weren't coming in like they used to. She was in her early 40s, navigating the treacherous terrain of being a mature actress in a town that barely tolerated women aging past 30. Enter All About Eve, a razor-sharp script about a fading Broadway star named Margot Channing, grappling with her own relevance, her vanity, and a cunning young upstart who wants to replace her. It was a role made of layered contradictions, glamorous but insecure, commanding yet vulnerable. It was Davis at her best, commanding, bitter, magnetic. Critics raved, audiences were transfixed, and when the Oscar nominations were announced, Bette was back in the game, nominated for Best Actress for the 8th time in her career. All About Eve proved that Bette Davis was still a force. Joan Crawford, on the other hand, wasn't even on the ballot. She'd had her own triumphant return a few years earlier with Mildred Pierce, which had won her an Oscar. But by 1950, Joan was stuck in underwhelming roles. Her star hadn't faded, but it had dimmed just enough to make her crave the spotlight again. By the early 1960s, both Joan Crawford and Bette Davis were confronting a grim reality. Hollywood had changed, the glamorous studio era was fading, and a new, younger generation of actors was taking over. For women like Joan Crawford and Bette Davis, both now in their 50s, meaningful roles were becoming rare. Hollywood wasn't kind to older women, especially those who had once reigned supreme. The scripts had dried up, the fan letters, fewer. The public, fascinated with younger stars, had begun filing these two icons into the former glory drawer. But neither Bette nor Joan was ready to retire, not quietly, and certainly not forgotten. And that's when opportunity knocked, or rather, limped in wearing caked-on makeup and dragging a doll by the hair. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was a psychological horror film about two aging sisters, one a crippled former movie star, the other a delusional ex-child star turned caretaker. It was disturbing, theatrical, and cheap to make. Most studios passed on it, but Crawford saw potential. She brought the script to director Robert Aldrich and suggested Davis for the co-lead. Joan Crawford saw potential in the script. Dark, twisted, and completely different from the soft glamour roles she'd been known for. And she knew exactly who should play the deranged, unhinged Jane Hudson. Bette Davis. Yes, Joan Crawford recommended Bette Davis for a role. And here's where things get interesting. Bette said yes. Why? Maybe the role was too good to refuse. Maybe she wanted to prove she still had it. Or maybe, and this is just speculation, she wanted to beat Crawford at her own game, on camera, with receipts. On paper, it was genius. Two aging titans, locked in a claustrophobic battle of resentment and madness. It would be spectacle. It would be buzzworthy. It would be, most importantly, a hit. And so, for the first time in their decades-long careers, Joan and Bette would share the screen. It was combustible from the start. The production was tense from the start. Bette Davis, playing the deranged and decaying baby Jane Hudson, went full method. She designed her own grotesque makeup, pale face, exaggerated eyes, chipped lipstick, and insisted on playing Jane as a woman who had given up on vanity long ago. Crawford, playing the wheelchair-bound Blanche, kept her image more intact, but that didn't mean she was holding back. Her performance was restrained, layered, and deeply uncomfortable. As filming progressed, so did the friction. There were reports, mostly exaggerated, of sabotaged costumes and scenes reshot out of spite. Crawford reportedly objected to Davis installing a Coca-Cola machine on set, knowing full well that Joan was a board member and widow of the chairman of Pepsi. Davis, naturally, denied it was intentional. In one scene, Davis was required to drag Crawford across the floor. Crawford, ever the strategist, allegedly filled her costume pockets with lead weights to make Davis's job harder. Bette's back was never the same. Davis allegedly retaliated during another scene by kicking her co-star in the head, so hard that Crawford needed stitches. All these were reportedly not true, but exaggerations added to the life of the feud by gossip columnists. Yet the on-screen magic was undeniable. Their reported hate translated into cinematic brilliance. The tension wasn't just acted, it was lived. Baby Jane became a critical and commercial success. When Oscar season arrived, Bette Davis was nominated for Best Actress, her 10th and final Oscar nomination. Joan Crawford wasn't nominated. And that's where things escalated. When it became clear Bette might win the Academy Award, Joan reached out to the other nominees who couldn't attend the ceremony. She offered to accept their awards on their behalf, just in case. And in a twist that could have been written for the screen, Anne Bancroft won for The Miracle Worker. Joan Crawford walked on stage, elegant and glowing, and accepted the Oscar on live television, while Bette Davis fumed backstage. It wasn't just petty, it was legendary. One could argue that Crawford was being helpful. Others might call it tactical humiliation. Either way, Baby Jane didn't heal the feud. It turned it into something nuclear. And Bette would talk about it till the day she died. The feud was no longer whispered. It was headline news. And the world, ever eager for a good catfight, was eating it up. After the success and chaos of whatever happened to Baby Jane, studios smelled opportunity. Aging actresses playing twisted, mentally unbalanced, and violent women?
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
These are the 1930s again.
I want it now.
Come on, Oscar. Let you and me get drunk.
There was a market for that. A deeply unsettling one, but a market nonetheless. Hollywood, of course, gave it a name. Hagsploitation or psychobiddy, and several studios raced to make their own versions.
Whatever happened to Aunt Alice? What's the matter with Helen?
Everybody was trying to get in. Joan and Bette were now unofficial queens of the genre, and everyone wanted a sequel. So producers tried to capture lightning in a bottle again. In 1964, producer Robert Aldrich attempted to reunite them for Hush-a-Hush, Sweet Charlotte, another Southern Gothic thriller, this time with Davis in the lead and Crawford as her estranged cousin. The script had everything: manipulation, murder, and plenty of room for behind-the-scenes mayhem. Filming began in Louisiana, but the reunion was over before it really started. By this point, their mutual loathing had taken root. Publicly, they were still professional. Behind the scenes? A masterclass in psychological warfare. From day one, production was a circus. Bette, who'd taken on a producing role, was reportedly domineering on set. She had influence over the script, the lighting, costuming, casting, and, according to Crawford, making the set very lonely. Joan, used to being treated like a queen, found herself isolated and increasingly sidelined. The environment was anything but warm. Joan, who had signed a contract and would probably be financially liable if she pulled out without reason, retaliated in her own way. She complained of illness, stretched shooting schedules, and then, halfway through filming, she checked herself into the hospital, claiming a mysterious ailment that made her too weak to continue. Davis didn't buy it. She claimed Joan was faking, dragging out hospital visits and calling in sick to delay filming. The studio panicked. Time was money, and Joan's absence was costing them both. After weeks of stalling, the studio eventually quietly replaced Crawford with Olivia de Havilland. Joan was probably relieved. Bette was triumphant. The press, of course, loved it. The feud had outgrown the films. It had become its own myth, a gladiatorial match between two aging queens, each swinging with stilettos and side-eyes instead of swords. But with time, both women began to feel the weight of their reputations. By the late 1960s and into the 70s, roles grew scarcer. Davis turned to television movies and stage work. Crawford took fewer projects, focusing instead on her public appearances, charity work, and her position on the Pepsi board. Both maintained their public images, but in private, the war was winding down. Mostly. But here's the thing. Under the pettiness, the insults, and the power plays, there was something far more human. Both Joan and Bette were survivors in a ruthless system. They had clawed their way to the top of a male-dominated industry that celebrated women for their beauty, then punished them for aging. They'd been pitted against each other by studios, the press, and even the roles they were given. One was glamour incarnate, the other grit and gravel. And in many ways, their feud gave them both a second act. As the 1970s rolled in, the once blazing careers of Joan Crawford and Bette Davis settled into twilight. Joan was the first to step back. She made her last public appearance in 1974 at a party alongside her friend Rosalind Russell. When she saw an unflattering photo of herself in the papers the next day, Joan, ever the image-conscious star, decided that was it. She withdrew from public life completely. Just 3 years later, on May 10, 1977, Joan Crawford passed away from a heart attack. Her funeral was private, no big Hollywood spectacle, just a quiet goodbye. But the silence didn't last. In 1978, her adopted daughter Christina released a memoir called Mommy Dearest, portraying Joan as an abusive, image-obsessed tyrant. The public, who once saw Joan as the epitome of class and control, now had a new image, a woman who screamed at wire hangers and tormented her children. Bette Davis, still very much alive, denounced the memoir and its portrayal of Joan. In her own words, "I was not Miss Crawford's biggest fan, but wisecracks to the contrary, I did and still do respect her talent. What she did not deserve was that detestable book written by her daughter. I've forgotten her name." Horrible. This quote shows Bette acknowledging their strained relationship, affirming Crawford's talent, but expressing distaste for the tell-all tone of the memoir and film. Bette generally avoided going into detail about Mommy Dearest in interviews. Interestingly, just a few years after the release of Mommy Dearest, Bette Davis faced a strikingly similar betrayal. In 1985, her daughter, B.D. Hyman, published My Mother's Keeper, a scathing memoir that portrayed Davis as a controlling, alcoholic mother. The book's tone and timing invited instant comparisons to Christina Crawford's tell-all about Joan. But, unlike Joan, Bette was still alive and furious. She publicly disowned B.D., calling the book a glaring lack of loyalty and thanks, and later excluded her from her will. Though Bette and Joan had spent years at odds, their legacies took an oddly parallel path. Two powerful women of Hollywood, both betrayed by their daughters and recast as villains in their own family sagas. And Bette? She kept going. Through illness, through stroke, through the shifting winds of Hollywood's tastes. She acted well into her 70s, gave interviews, threw shade with her signature bluntness, and wore her difficult reputation like a crown. She even starred in made-for-TV horror films and talk shows, refusing to be forgotten. But time, as always, had the final say. On October 6, 1989, Bette Davis died of breast cancer. She was 81. In one of her last interviews, she said, "Getting old is not for sissies." And she wasn't one. In the end, the Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford feud wasn't just Hollywood drama. It was a mirror held up to an industry that devours its legends and pits them against each other for entertainment. Were they rivals? Absolutely. But they were also survivors. Women who clawed their way to the top, refused to go quietly, and became immortal in the process. The feud was real. But so were the forces that created it. And for all the snubs, slights, and Oscar stunts, Joan Crawford and Bette Davis remain exactly what neither ever wanted to be forgotten, as legends. Whether you're Team Bette, Team Joan, or just here for the stories, they both earned their place in film history. If you enjoyed this dive into Hollywood's most iconic rivalry, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales of famous feuds in history. Until next time, stay dramatic.